In the darkest days of Nazi Germany, loyalty to the Reich was everything. But what happens when your heart leads you somewhere else? Today, we explore the forbidden relationships between Nazi soldiers and Jewish women. How did they reconcile love with hate? And what were the consequences of such choices in a world built on fear and power? The rise of Nazi Germany was built on a foundation of hatred. Hatred for Jews, for those deemed undesirable, and for anything that threatened the ideology of the Reich. From the moment Adolf Hitler rose to power, the nation was consumed with a singular vision: the superiority of the Aryan race, and the systematic eradication or subjugation of those who didn't fit into this vision. But in the midst of this darkness, there were stories that defied the very core of Nazi doctrine. Stories of Nazi soldiers falling in love with Jewish women. At first glance, such relationships might seem unimaginable. Nazi soldiers, deeply entrenched in the propaganda of their time, were trained to see Jews as the enemy. They were taught that the very survival of Germany depended on the destruction of the Jewish people. But love doesn't always follow the rules set by society or government. It has a way of blossoming in even the most unlikely places. How does one explain the growing bond between a soldier sworn to the service of the Reich and a Jewish woman oppressed and vulnerable under its laws? How could love take root in a society that demanded they hate each other? The stories of these forbidden relationships are not just about defiance or rebellion. They are about the complexities of human emotions, the profound struggle between the heart and the mind, and the cost of loving someone in a world where love was considered treason. But what happened when their secret love was exposed? Could love survive in a world where betrayal and loyalty were matters of life and death? The men who found themselves drawn to Jewish women during the Nazi era were not the heroes of history. They were soldiers, deeply indoctrinated into the violent ideologies of their time, surrounded by propaganda that painted Jews as the enemy, the ultimate threat to Germany's survival. Yet in the shadows of war and hatred, a few soldiers experienced a conflict that could not be ignored, an internal battle between loyalty to their nation and the overwhelming force of love. Take, for example, the story of Heinrich Müller, a young SS officer stationed in Warsaw. Like many others, Müller had been raised to believe that his duty to the Reich was everything. His job was to enforce the laws, monitor the ghettos, and help carry out the horrific orders given by his superiors. But when he met Rachel, a Jewish woman who had been forced into labor in the occupied city, something inside him shifted. Rachel wasn't just a prisoner. She was a person, with hopes, dreams, and a life that extended beyond the label he had been taught to assign her. Müller and Rachel's relationship began with small acts of defiance, sneaking her extra food, offering protection when her colleagues were being beaten, and finally, one fateful night when he helped her escape a raid. What began as an act of rebellion soon evolved into a deep emotional connection. Despite the dangers, Müller found himself in love, a love that defied everything he had ever been taught. The war that consumed his world was no longer about blind obedience. It became about the woman he loved, and the future they dreamed of together, far away from the oppressive regime he had once vowed to serve. But Müller wasn't alone in this struggle. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, there were others like him, soldiers who, in the face of everything they were taught to believe, found themselves captivated by Jewish women, compelled by forces beyond their control. For some, this love was fleeting, a brief escape from the horrors of war. But for others, it became a defining part of their lives, one that would follow them long after the war ended. The question remains: how could these men, who had once pledged their loyalty to a regime that dehumanized an entire people, reconcile their feelings of love for someone they were trained to hate? How could they confront the deep conflict within themselves, the pull of duty versus the pull of love? In the secrecy of Nazi-occupied territories, relationships between Nazi soldiers and Jewish women were nothing short of dangerous. These love affairs were not born out of easy circumstances. They were acts of rebellion in a world that demanded strict adherence to a ruthless ideology.
Every stolen glance, every whispered conversation was a betrayal of the regime's rules, and the stakes were impossibly high. For many of these couples, the relationships existed in the shadows. The soldiers, sworn to secrecy, would meet their Jewish partners in dark alleys or hidden rooms. Any trace of affection could lead to arrest, torture, or worse. In fact, simply associating with a Jew was a crime punishable by death. But for some soldiers, the risk became worth the cost. Mueller and Rachel's relationship was carefully concealed behind the walls of an underground apartment where they would occasionally steal moments together. It was a love founded not on grand gestures, but on small stolen acts of kindness and defiance. They could not hold hands in public or share a kiss in day-bright light. Every moment they spent together was woven with the fear of discovery. But in those fleeting moments, the world outside seemed to vanish. But as the war progressed and Nazi authorities tightened their grip on occupied cities, the couple's secret became increasingly difficult to maintain. Soldiers who began questioning the morality of the war were not only jeopardizing their own lives, but also the lives of the women they loved. The Gestapo was always watching, always searching for ways to root out dissent. And other couples, too, faced the constant threat of exposure. Some soldiers, unable to carry on in secret, eventually turned in their Jewish partners, driven by fear of the consequences they might face if they were caught harboring or loving someone considered undesirable. Some women, fearful of what might happen to the soldiers they loved, left them, unable to risk their lives any further. And for those who were discovered, the consequences were brutal and swift. For the men, it could mean immediate execution. For the women, it often meant being sent to labor camps, or worse, facing death at the hands of their former lovers' comrades. But not all stories ended in tragedy. A few couples managed to flee, hiding in plain sight by assuming false identities and relying on the help of underground resistance groups. For some, the war's end marked the beginning of a new life together, though it came with its own challenges. The psychological scars of living through the horrors of the war, and along with the stigma of their relationships, lingered long after the Nazis had been defeated.
Before the majority, when these relationships were uncovered, there was no escape. What became of these couples when their love was exposed? Could love truly triumph in a world where loyalty to the Reich meant death for those who dared defy it? For Nazi soldiers, loyalty to the Reich was more than just a duty. It was an ideology that governed every aspect of their lives. From an early age, they were immersed in a world of rigid belief systems, where hate was taught as a virtue, and love for the enemy was unthinkable. But the reality of these soldiers' emotions, when they encountered Jewish women, starkly contrasted the indoctrination they had been subjected to. The conflict between their deeply ingrained beliefs and the feelings growing inside them created a psychological tension that many could not resolve. Nazi propaganda was powerful. It painted Jews as subhuman, as the root cause of Germany's problems, and anyone who aligned themselves with such a group was considered a traitor. Soldiers were constantly reminded that their service to the Reich was a service to Germany itself, a service that demanded loyalty above all else. They were told that to fight the war and uphold the Aryan ideal was a noble duty, one that justified any act, no matter how brutal. But in the chaos of war, when soldiers were far from home and faced with the human cost of their actions, these beliefs began to waver. For some, the ideology that had shaped their worldview suddenly seemed inadequate in explaining their feelings. How could they love the very people they were told to destroy? How could they reconcile the terror they had inflicted upon the Jewish population with the tenderness they felt for one woman who was supposed to represent everything they were raised to oppose? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming for many of these soldiers. On one hand, they were raised to believe the Jewish people were the enemy of the German state, their very existence a threat to the Aryan race. On the other hand, they found themselves drawn to the women they were trained to hate. This inner conflict became even more intense as the relationships deepened and the soldiers were forced to confront their beliefs.
For soldiers like Müller, it was a slow unraveling of everything they had been taught. The first act of kindness toward Rachel, a simple gesture to protect her from a raid, felt like an innocent defiance. But as the relationship grew, so did the realization that the lies they had been fed no longer made sense. Their affection for Jewish women was an emotional truth, one that could not be easily erased by the propaganda they had internalized. The psychological burden became unbearable for some. The pull of love clashed violently with the overwhelming pressure to remain loyal to the ideals of the Reich. Many soldiers wrestled with guilt, not just for the forbidden relationships, but also for the betrayal they felt they were committing against their comrades and the Nazi cause. The fear of discovery was always present, but so was the fear of becoming weak, of being seen as unworthy by their fellow soldiers. The very act of love now felt like a rebellion against everything they had once believed in. Could they ever escape the psychological prison built by years of indoctrination? Or were these soldiers forever trapped in the conflict between love and duty? While the Nazi soldiers' stories are often the focus of these forbidden relationships, it's equally important to understand the perspective of the Jewish women involved. These women, living in the most harrowing of circumstances, faced not only the brutality of Nazi oppression, but also the complex emotions that came with being in love with someone who in any other context would have been their enemy. Their struggles were both emotional and physical, as they navigated an impossible reality. For many of the Jewish women who found themselves entangled in these relationships, there was an initial hesitation, even fear. These were women who had lived through the early stages of the Nazi occupation, witnessing the systematic destruction of their families and communities. Trust, already a fragile thing in a world that had turned against them, became even more elusive when it came to a Nazi soldier. How could they trust someone who had likely participated in the very atrocities that had destroyed their world? But human connection has a way of breaking through even the most formidable barriers. For some Jewish women, the Nazi soldiers who crossed their paths were not just faceless enemies. They were individuals who, despite the horrors of the war, showed kindness and compassion. In moments of fear and vulnerability, they were willing to offer help, sometimes in subtle ways. For some women, this kindness was a flicker of hope in a world otherwise bleak, and it led to something deeper. One such woman was Miriam, a young Jewish woman from Krakow whose relationship with a German soldier, Wilhelm, began when he risked his life to protect her during a raid. Though she initially viewed him with suspicion, Miriam could not deny the genuine concern he showed her in the midst of chaos. As their relationship grew, Miriam found herself grappling with emotions she had never expected to feel. Emotions that contradicted everything she knew about the soldier and everything she had been taught about the enemy.
However, the conflict wasn't only internal. Miriam and other Jewish women in similar situations faced the harsh reality of their position. Their relationship could mean certain death for both them and their soldier partners. Any suspicion, any hint of their love affair being discovered could lead to arrest, imprisonment, or worse. The secrecy was suffocating, the constant fear of discovery, a daily torment. These women lived on the edge, unable to fully express their emotions or build a future with their lovers. Despite the dangers, many of these women chose to embrace their love, knowing the risks. But it wasn't just about defying the Nazi regime. It was about finding a small glimmer of humanity in a time of unimaginable suffering. For these women, the love they shared with Nazi soldiers was not just an act of defiance. It was a fleeting attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, tenderness, and connection in a world gone mad.
The psychological toll was also immense. These women lived in constant fear of betrayal, both from their partners and from the world around them. At the same time, they had to grapple with the ethical dilemma of their love. Could they truly love a man who was part of the system that sought to destroy their people? Was love enough to redeem him, or did it make them complicit in the crimes of the Reich? In a world where betrayal was a constant threat, how could these women reconcile their love with their past? Could they ever truly trust these men, or were they simply tools of the very system that had ravaged their lives? The consequences of falling in love with someone deemed the enemy during Nazi Germany were as brutal as they were inevitable. These relationships, built in secrecy and under the constant threat of exposure, were considered not only acts of betrayal but also crimes punishable by death. When love crossed the line in a regime built on control, hatred, and fear, the repercussions were swift and unforgiving. For the Nazi soldiers who dared to love Jewish women, the punishment was severe and often deadly. The Nazi regime did not tolerate disobedience or weakness. Loyalty to the Reich was demanded above all else. A soldier's personal feelings, especially if they conflicted with Nazi doctrine, were irrelevant. Once discovered, these relationships were considered treason, and the punishment was typically execution. Heinrich Müller's story is one of many tragic examples. After months of secretly meeting Rachel, the pair's relationship was discovered by a fellow officer who, fearing punishment for his own actions, betrayed them both. Müller was immediately arrested, and Rachel was sent to a labor camp. For Müller, his fate was sealed. Despite his military rank and prior loyalty to the Reich, he was swiftly tried for treason. The betrayal by a fellow soldier, the loss of Rachel, and the realization that his love had cost him everything shattered him emotionally. His trial was swift, and his execution followed soon after. His death, a stark reminder of the cost of loving outside the rigid boundaries of Nazi law, left Rachel with nothing but memories of a grief-stolen love. Jewish women, too, faced horrific consequences when their relationships were discovered. Women like Miriam, who had dared to love against the backdrop of war and hatred, often faced even harsher punishments. The discovery of their relationships could mean immediate imprisonment, torture, and execution. The Nazis saw their involvement with German soldiers as a further betrayal, an act of defiance that threatened the very racial purity they were fighting to maintain. Miriam's story, much like many others, ended in tragedy. When her relationship with Wilhelm was discovered, she was arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Wilhelm, too, faced severe punishment, but it was the women who often bore the brunt of the consequences. The brutal nature of their treatment was designed not just to punish, but to send a message. To love a Nazi soldier was a crime against the state, and no one, regardless of their status or their emotions, was above the law. For those who were able to survive the immediate danger, the emotional and psychological toll of their punishment was lasting. The weight of betrayal, the loss of their loved ones, and the torment of knowing that their love was seen as a crime haunted these women for the rest of their lives. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, as well as the stigma of their relationships. How could they ever return to a normal life after being labeled as traitors? And for the soldiers who survived, the emotional scars of their actions were just as profound. Could they live with the knowledge that their love, once pure, had led to such destruction? But not every story ended with punishment. Some managed to escape, or even to survive the war. How did they find a way to rebuild their lives after facing the most unimaginable costs? Could love in the end survive the consequences of defying the Reich? The love between Nazi soldiers and Jewish women existed in the shadows. They could never hold hands in public, never share a kiss without fear, and every moment spent together was one fraught with peril. In a world dominated by war, hate, and surveillance, these couples existed in a constant state of anxiety, living a double life that demanded secrecy, cunning, and incredible resilience. For many of these soldiers, their love affairs became not just acts of rebellion, but a desperate attempt to find humanity in a world stripped of it. The soldiers, in their private moments, were often caught between the heart-wrenching affection they felt for their partners and the oppressive regime they had pledged to serve. Each meeting, each stolen moment was a risk they were willing to take, yet the cost was always at the back of their minds. Müller's relationship with Rachel, for example, was marked with secrecy and constant fear.
Every interaction between them was a calculated risk. They met in hidden places, away from the eyes of other soldiers, where they could momentarily pretend that the outside world, the brutality, the hatred, did not exist. The secrecy was suffocating, and yet it was the only way they could maintain their connection. They communicated in whispers and coded messages, always alert for signs that they were being watched. For Miriam and Wilhelm, the situation was no different. Wilhelm would often risk his life to sneak her small comforts, food, a coat, or just a quiet moment together away from prying eyes. The terror of being discovered was ever present. The relationship could not be public. It could never survive in the light of day. If anyone found out, if anyone learned the truth, it would mean their end. The stakes were too high, the punishment too brutal, to ever allow love to be something visible, something real in the world they lived in. They developed a system of clandestine meetings, relying on a network of resistance members or sympathetic people who helped shield them from Nazi eyes. These helpers in many cases were risking their own lives by allowing such relationships to flourish in the shadows. Some of the couples found ways to mask their meetings under the guise of everyday activities, going to a market, visiting a friend, anything that could be used to explain why they were seen together.
But the constant fear of discovery was an emotional weight that took its toll on the couples. Trust was always fragile. They couldn't truly relax, couldn't let their guard down for fear that one mistake, one misplaced glance or word could expose them. The soldiers knew that if their love was discovered, they would face certain death, but they also understood that the women they loved would face a fate far worse: torture, imprisonment, and execution. For these couples, the bonds they shared were forged in secrecy, in moments of fleeting tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the war and hate that surrounded them. Yet the secrecy came with a price. Love was constantly threatened by the looming possibility of betrayal. Anyone in their circle could be a potential spy, and every relationship, no matter how close, was under suspicion. In a world where trust was a luxury few could afford, even love had its limits. But no secret can stay hidden forever. As the war raged on, the reality of their situation became increasingly impossible to maintain. How long could these relationships survive the constant pressure of secrecy and fear? Would their love endure, or would it crumble under the weight of the world around them? As the war came to an end, the world was forever changed. For the Nazi soldiers who had fallen in love with Jewish women, the aftermath was a moment of reckoning. The war had ended, but their actions, their relationships, and the consequences of their defiance remained. The world was shifting, but for these men and women, the shadows of the past followed them relentlessly. Some of these soldiers, having survived the horrors of the war, found themselves in a post-war world that demanded accountability. For many, the love they had once shared in secret now became part of a painful legacy. The questions loomed. Could they ever be free from the consequences of their actions? Could their love for Jewish women, once a dangerous rebellion against the Reich, find a place in the new world, where justice and retribution were being meted out for those who had supported the Nazi cause? For those who had been captured and tried in the aftermath of the war, their consequences were immediate. Many faced harsh sentences at the Nuremberg trials and other war crimes tribunals, where their personal lives became part of the historical record. Their relationships were dissected as part of the broader narrative of Nazi atrocities. The idea of love between a soldier and a Jewish woman became both a symbol of defiance and a reminder of the complex moral realities of war. For some, their punishment was swift and final, as the weight of their choices was laid bare in the courtrooms. But not all of the soldiers faced such public reckoning. Some managed to escape, fleeing to countries where they could live under assumed identities. These soldiers lived in constant fear, unable to ever truly leave behind the ghosts of their past. They could never escape the trauma, the guilt, and the emotional burden of the relationships they had formed. Even if they managed to survive the war and the post-war world, their pasts, defined by love, betrayal, and conflict, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Jewish women involved in these relationships faced their own struggles. For some, the end of the war meant liberation from the concentration camps, but it also meant confronting the trauma of their experiences. Many had lost their families, their homes, and their entire way of life. And for those who had been in relationships with Nazi soldiers, the burden was even greater. They were often ostracized, both by their communities and by their fellow Jews, who viewed them as traitors. The stigma of having loved a Nazi soldier, even in the context of their suffering, followed them long after the war ended.
For others, the end of the war marked the beginning of an uncertain journey. Some of the couples who had survived the war tried to rebuild their lives, but the psychological scars were deep. The emotional toll of living in secrecy, the weight of their betrayal, and the guilt that accompanied their love left an indelible mark on their relationships. Even if they managed to stay together, their past was never truly behind them. But could love, no matter how pure, ever truly overcome the shadow of the war? As the world moved on, were these couples able to find peace, or did their pasts, haunted by war and betrayal, forever shape their futures? The emotional and psychological toll of these forbidden relationships was profound, and for both the Nazi soldiers and the Jewish women involved, the scars were long-lasting. Love, in the context of war, betrayal, and fear, became a double-edged sword, offering moments of human connection amidst the horrors, but also serving as a constant reminder of the violence and betrayal that surrounded them. For the Nazi soldiers, the psychological strain was multifaceted. On one hand, they had been raised and indoctrinated into a system that demanded absolute loyalty to the Reich and taught them to despise Jews. To love a Jewish woman was to directly contradict everything they had been taught, creating an internal conflict that many soldiers found impossible to reconcile. Their sense of duty to the Nazi regime, the guilt they carried for the atrocities they had committed or witnessed, and their love for these women created a psychological tension that could not be easily erased. The love they felt was not only forbidden, it was a betrayal of everything they had once believed in. Many soldiers, after the war ended, struggled to live with the guilt of what they had done, and the love they had felt became a painful reminder of their actions. For soldiers like Müller, who had once been certain of their loyalty to the Reich, this internal struggle was even intense. The act of falling in love with someone they were taught to hate forced them to question the very core of their identity. Their entire sense of self had been built on the foundations of Nazi ideology, and once that foundation cracked, it left them unsure of who they were or where they belonged. The cognitive dissonance, the inability to reconcile the image of the soldier they had been with the man they had become, was debilitating. For some, it led to depression, isolation, and a deep sense of hopelessness. The memories of the woman they loved were often mingled with the guilt of their past, creating a permanent emotional scar. For the Jewish women, the psychological toll was as severe, if not more so. The trauma they had experienced at the hands of the Nazis was already immense. Losing their families, their homes, and their freedom had already left them broken. But for those who fell in love with Nazi soldiers, the emotional burden was even greater. Their love was not only a betrayal to their own people, but it was also tainted by the fear of discovery. The danger was not just physical, it was emotional too. Could they truly trust a man who had once been their enemy? Was the love they felt for him an act of survival, or was it something deeper? Many of these women struggled with feelings of guilt and shame. They had loved men who had been part of the system that had sought to destroy their people. In some cases, they were forced to question their own motivations. Was their love a form of Stockholm Syndrome? Were they just trying to find any semblance of comfort in a world of pain? These questions haunted them long after the war ended. And even as they tried to rebuild their lives, the emotional weight of their relationships lingered.
Some women, like Miriam, who had found a brief spark of love in the midst of unimaginable horror, carried the emotional burden of their actions long after the war. Could they ever truly be free from the memories of their forbidden love, Or would it always be a part of their history, a dark chapter they could never fully escape? Mini cliffhanger. For these survivors, love was both a gift and a curse. Could they ever find healing from the trauma of the war, or would their forbidden love always remain a source of conflict in their minds and hearts? As the years passed, the legacy of these forbidden relationships remained a complex and painful chapter in the history of World War II. For those who survived, the emotional scars never fully healed, and the consequences of their actions were far-reaching. Their stories were often overshadowed by the greater tragedy of the Holocaust, yet they represent an important, albeit controversial aspect of the human experience during a time of unimaginable evil. In the post-war world, these couples, both Nazi soldiers and Jewish women, were often left to navigate the murky waters of guilt, shame, and survival. The soldiers, many of whom had been tried for war crimes or forced to live in hiding, struggled with their role in a regime that had brought death and destruction to millions. The love they had shared with Jewish women, once a source of both emotional refuge and rebellion, now became a painful reminder of their complicity in the atrocities of the war. Could love, in such a context, ever be pure, or was it forever tainted by the darkness that had surrounded it? For the Jewish women, the emotional toll was no less significant. Even if they managed to survive the war, they faced rejection from their communities in the broader Jewish world. Their love, seen by many as an act of betrayal, made it impossible to fully reintegrate into a society that had suffered unimaginable losses at the hands of Nazi Germany. The stigma of their relationships remained with them, even as they tried to rebuild their lives. They were often forced to live in silence, their experiences dismissed or misunderstood by those who had not lived through the horrors they had endured. In the broader historical context, these relationships challenge the black and white narrative of good versus evil that often dominates discussions of the Nazi era. They remind us that the human heart is capable of both incredible cruelty and extraordinary love, often in the most unlikely and unexpected circumstances. The soldiers who fell in love with Jewish women were not simple villains. They were complex individuals, shaped by a society that demanded conformity and hatred, yet capable of acts of kindness and even love in defiance of the very system they served. The legacy of these forbidden relationships raises difficult moral questions. Can love redeem those who were complicit in evil? Can the human heart, when subjected to years of hatred and violence, ever truly be trusted? The answers are elusive, and the consequences of these love stories are still being debated to this day. For future generations, these stories serve as enduring reminders of the moral complexities of war and human connection. They challenge us to think critically about the choices we make, the ideologies we follow, and the relationships we form, especially in times of conflict. In the end, these love stories, though born in secrecy and forbidden passion, remind us of the complexity of human nature, the capacity for both deep love and profound betrayal. As we reflect on these stories, we are left with one haunting question. Can love ever truly overcome the darkest of histories, or does the weight of the past forever cast a shadow on the future?